On the evening of November 24th, 1971, a commercial airliner climbed into a rain-darkened sky over the Pacific Northwest, carrying a passenger who had given his name as Dan Cooper. He looked unremarkable: a dark business suit, a black tie, a quiet voice that ordered bourbon and soda before the plane had even left the gate. By the time that flight landed again, $200,000 would be gone, 2 parachutes would be missing, and a man would have vanished into the clouds over Washington State, never seen again. But the real story isn't just what happened in the air that night. It's everything that came after. The longest manhunt in the FBI's history, the suspects who almost fit, and one small, stubborn clue that, more than 50 years later, still refuses to make sense. It was the day before Thanksgiving. Northwest Orient Flight 305 was a short, unremarkable hop from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington. 36 passengers, a flight crew of 6, nothing on the schedule that suggested anything but turkey dinners waiting at the other end. The man calling himself Dan Cooper paid cash for a one-way ticket. He took a seat near the back of the cabin and ordered a drink while the aircraft idled on the tarmac, rain tracing slow lines down the window beside him. Then he passed a note to the flight attendant in the row ahead of him. At first, she assumed it was a phone number, the kind of thing a stranger on a plane might slip a flight attendant, and tucked it into her pocket without reading it. He leaned in and told her quietly to look at it. There was a bomb in his briefcase, he said. When he opened the case for her, she saw wires and red cylindrical sticks packed inside. Whether the device was real, no one would ever be able to confirm. The note itself was taken back by Cooper before agents could examine it. But on a darkening runway, with 35 other passengers still aboard, no one was willing to test it. She would later describe the calm in his voice as the strangest part. Not anger, not panic, just a flat, patient certainty. The voice of a man who already knew exactly how the next several hours were going to go. His demands were specific: $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve. When Flight 305 touched down in Seattle, Cooper kept his word. The 36 passengers walked free in exchange for the money and the chutes, relief written across faces that had spent 2 hours not knowing whether they would see their families again. But the ordeal wasn't over for everyone aboard. 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant stayed behind as the plane refueled on the tarmac, preparing, under Cooper's orders, for a second flight, this time toward Mexico City. He had instructions for that flight, too. Stay below 10,000 feet, keep the speed under 200 knots, leave the landing gear down. Conditions that would make almost any other passenger miserable. For a man planning to jump out the back of the aircraft, they were exactly what he needed. Investigators later noted something else about him. He seemed to know the Boeing 727 well enough to ask precise questions about refueling procedures, well enough to know exactly how the rear air stair worked. Whether that knowledge came from military training, aviation work, or simple careful planning, no one was ever able to say for certain. Somewhere between Seattle and Reno, in the cold dark above the Cascade foothills, a little after 8 o'clock that night, Cooper lowered the rear air stair of the Boeing 727. The crew felt the plane shudder, a sudden change in cabin pressure, a jolt running through the tail section. Then nothing. When the aircraft landed in Reno, Cooper was gone. So was the money. So were 2 of the parachutes. He was never seen again. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in American aviation history. The FBI opened a case file under the name NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking, and sent agents into the dense, rain-soaked forest southeast of Ariel, Washington, the area investigators believed was closest to Cooper's likely landing zone. Search teams combed through fir trees and underbrush for weeks. Helicopters passed low over Lake Merwin. At one point, the U.S. Air Force flew an SR-31 Blackbird along the flight path, hoping to photograph anything Cooper might have left behind on the ground. Poor visibility made the photographs useless. The terrain itself worked against them: steep ridgelines, standing water, Douglas fir packed so densely that ground teams sometimes lost sight of each other a few yards apart. By December, an early winter had settled over the search zone, the kind of cold, wet quiet that makes a landscape feel like it's holding its breath. No parachute, no money, no body, nothing at all. On the plane itself, investigators found almost nothing: a black clip-on tie, a tie clip, a few cigarette butts in the ashtray of seat 18C. No fingerprints anywhere, not on the seat, not on the note, not on the parachute harnesses. Decades later, DNA would be extracted from the tie, and according to files released as recently as 2025, investigators would also find it coated with thousands of microscopic metal particles, including rare elements used in specialized manufacturing. It suggested Cooper may have worked somewhere industrial. It did not say where or who he was. Even the eyewitnesses couldn't agree. Some described his complexion as olive-toned, with a faintly Latin appearance. Others were certain he was a white man in his 50s. The FBI's first sketch was so far off the mark that flight crew members joked it looked more like Bing Crosby than the man they had seen. A second sketch followed months later, closer but still imperfect. When witnesses can't agree on a face, a sketch can only do so much.
What investigators could agree on was the planning behind it. This wasn't an impulsive act. He chose a route with remote, forested terrain below it. He requested a plane configuration that made a low, slow jump possible. He took his note back so it couldn't be examined. He even asked, partway through the flight, whether one of the parachutes had been tampered with. Methodical, almost clinical, right up until the moment he stepped out into the dark. Profilers who studied the case later described it less as a crime of desperation and more as a crime of preparation. A man who had likely rehearsed this moment for a long time before he ever boarded that plane. And there were a great many suspects to consider. By the case's 5-year anniversary, the FBI had reviewed more than 800 names. Over the following decades, that number grew past 1,000. In 1976, with the statute of limitations approaching, a Portland grand jury took the unusual step of indicting John Doe, also known as Dan Cooper, a placeholder name, filed against no one in particular, simply to keep the door open for prosecution if the hijacker were ever identified. One of the most persistent suspects was Richard Floyd McCoy, Jr., a Vietnam veteran and skilled parachutist who carried out an almost identical hijacking less than 5 months later. For a while, investigators were certain they had their man, but the flight attendants who had sat closest to Cooper didn't recognize McCoy's face, and pieces of his timeline didn't line up cleanly either. He was eventually ruled out. Another name surfaced years later: Kenneth Christensen, a former Army paratrooper who had worked for Northwest Orient as a mechanic and flight attendant. His own brother, watching a documentary on the case long after Christensen's death, became convinced the resemblance was too strong to ignore. Investigators were never able to confirm it. Other names followed: Robert Rackstraw, a former pilot with a long criminal record who later staged his own death in an unrelated fraud case. William Gossett, a veteran who reportedly claimed late in life to be Cooper himself, though he left no evidence to support it. None of it ever amounted to proof. Then, in February of 1980, the case took an unexpected turn. An 8-year-old boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar uncovered a rotting bundle of $20 bills. The serial numbers matched the ransom money exactly. For years, this was treated as the strongest physical clue in the entire investigation, evidence, many believed, that Cooper had come down somewhere along the river and the cash had simply drifted downstream over time. But the river kept one more secret. In 2020, researchers studying the bills under a microscope found microscopic diatoms, a type of algae, embedded in the paper. The particular species present only bloom in spring. Cooper jumped in late November. If the diatoms were right, the money hadn't entered the water until months after the hijacking, which meant the simplest explanation for how it got there may have been wrong all along. Even after the official trail went cold, the case never really stopped moving. Amateur investigators kept filing Freedom of Information requests. Retired agents kept revisiting their old notes. Every few years, a newly declassified batch of FBI files would surface, and a fresh wave of theories would follow it, usually pointing at someone new, almost never proving anything. It became less a case to be closed and more a puzzle the public refused to put down. After 45 years, more than 1,000 interviews, and one of the most exhaustive manhunts in its history, the FBI made a decision. On July 8, 2016, the Bureau formally redirected the resources assigned to the Cooper case towards other investigative priorities. The file wasn't closed in the sense of being solved, it was simply set down. To this day, it remains the only unsolved hijacking in the history of American commercial aviation. The case did leave something behind, though, something most people never think about when they fly: the peepholes in cockpit doors, the mandatory screening of every passenger and every bag before boarding. Those changes trace back in part to one man who walked off the back of a plane into a storm and was never seen again. Somewhere in the dense, rain-heavy forests of southwest Washington, there may still be a parachute, a rusted buckle, a set of boons no one has ever found. Or there may be nothing at all, just a man who calculated correctly that the easiest way to disappear was to let the sky keep his secret.